A lot of people get really hung up on like individual plants, right? So, like, you have a tomato, a single tomato that you have planted. Um, this is kind of universally a bad idea. So, you take a couple seeds. This is, broke gardening. Take a couple seeds and you put them in a little pot like this. Now, I use Pro Mix and I use this stuff here. And it's biofungicide because a lot of times starts they get dampening off where the very bottom of the stem gets very thin and then the whole thing falls over and they die, and they're very little when this happens sometimes. So I use that biofungicide because it kills the fungus that makes damping off happen. So let's continue. We've got these little tomatoes. These are about, I don't know, less than 2 weeks old. They're just little babies. We're going to leave them completely alone because we can see they're only just starting to make their first leaves, right? So you just keep it a little bit damp to the touch, the soil, by putting water in the bottom of a container. You put this inside a container and water it up above the bottom so they can drink from their butts. The tomatoes will continue to grow those secondary leaves. When they've got 3, 4 secondary leaves, you can see there we have 3, right? And those little bottom ones that look boring, those are the beginner leaves. Those just come from the seed. At this point, you can change their pot. You can move them. Tomatoes are easy because tomatoes don't mind if you screw around with their roots. They're not really tender, scared. You can really, really abuse tomatoes, and most of the time they will be just fine. So you can dig them out of the soil, those little babies, once they get about this size, yank them right out of there, and just stick them deep, deep, deep in the dirt. So these originally were almost as tall as this. And I just dug them all the way down in there and literally buried the stems. When you bury the stems, the tomatoes will make things called air roots. And when the stems are buried, I'm looking for a good air root. See those little white nubbins coming out of the bottom of that one? Those are called air roots or aerated roots. If those were under the dirt, they would make roots. They would give this tomato plant a lot of roots. So you can really bury them deep. If I was going to repot these, I'd take this leaf off and bury them up to about there, so that all of those little air roots can get into the soil. However, I am lazy and I don't have a lot of pots, so they're going to stay in this. But when I bury them in the garden, I am going to bury them very deep, maybe up to about there. That's the second. See, these are their beginner leaves. I'll bury it up. I'll take that bottom leaf off and bury it up to the second leaf. It can be really nerve-wracking sometimes because you get this huge, huge tomato plant, right? And it's just in a little cup. But you might even notice it's like purpling a little bit on the leaves or here and there. That just means it needs some nutrients. So instead of using the biofungicide, the starter soil, I'll just put some regular dirt in there or a little bit of compost in with it when I do uppot it. Or I'll put a little in there on top and water through it, just so it gets a little more nutrients. But this big ass plant in this tiny little cup, this can get twice as big. It'll be root bound. And then when I bury it outside and plant it in the garden or into a bigger container for container gardening, it'll make new roots all along there. I can already see little air roots trying to start. So bury it then, and it'll put on a big new burst of growth. Tomatoes are really hard to upset. They're the easiest thing, I think, for starting. Now I have this whole setup. I've got this shelf and all these racks and all this crap. But all you really need, you need one tray. You need some cups or containers of any kind with holes in the bottom to up pot once. And you need biofungicide dirt. I would suggest buying that big bag of Pro Mix. Buy it one time, and if you're not like doing extreme shit, it'll last you a year or two. And then literally one container of any kind of nitrogen fertilizer. So, fish fertilizer is usually the cheapest, $10 for a bottle. Just mix it in with the water you're watering them with once they get big. Wait until they get big. And that's it. That's all you really need. If you don't have a good window, these little LED strips are really cheap. They're like a couple bucks. You can get old shop lights, like these ones I have up top here. I got those for free like somebody was just getting rid of them. Or you can just get like a light fixture and a single full spectrum light bulb. Put it real close to the tray, and then keep it relatively close to the plant. And then as the plant gets big, you can move it further and further away. If you have a really good window that gets full daylight all day, sometimes you can just do them in there. If you really want them to start early and hardy, you can get yourself a heat mat, one of those little black mats that goes underneath the tray. But I only have those under some of these things. Most of these don't have a heat mat. They're just in a warm place with enough light. If you don't have labels, these things, because these can cost a couple bucks, you can just literally take some old coffee cups, slice them up into slices, and then use a grease pen. They call them China markers, but it's just a wax pencil, and write on the little piece of coffee cup or piece of cardboard or anything, write on that. Or you can write directly on the container if you're using these cheap, cups or whatever. Just write on it with this wax pencil, and that's a good label. I lose these little plastic labels that cost money. Somebody gave me a bunch, and I'm still going through the bunch, so I have tons of them. But when I run out, I'm not going to worry. I'll just cut up a can, aluminum can, or a cup or something, plastic, and I'll just write on them with that wax pencil. So that's tomatoes. They're the easiest. If you're just starting, I would say start with tomatoes, because they are the easiest thing to get going. They're very forgiving of bad handling. They tolerate a lot of abuse. They actually kind of do better if they're abused. The next thing I would suggest is oregano and basil. This is oregano. It has been severely neglected. Like, I threw a bunch of seed in here, 4 or 5 seeds in here, and then I forgot that I did it, and it just sat there, and it didn't get watered, and it wasn't on a heat mat, and it still is making an oregano plant. I'm going to eat this. I'm going to eat this later this year. I'll put it in the garden when it's nice and warm out, and it'll actually get big and huge and bushy, just from this little crappy thing. Sage is another one. Sage is delicious. It takes a lot of abuse. It doesn't really care what you do with it. If you forget to water it, if you water it too much, it might look a little weird, but as soon as you get it into a big container or into the ground, it just takes off. Here are some basil plants. With those, the only important thing is water. They want a lot of water, and they want to be warm. You can put any kind of pot into your windowsill, and make sure that there's a bottom container that always has water in it. Always has water in it, and they will just grow. They will grow. They'll get big, they'll get huge, you'll have way too much basil. Same goes for nasturtium. I also have here, this is last year's oregano. You can see it's still pretty big, even though I chopped it all back in the fall. It's coming back. This is thyme. Thyme is another really easy one to grow because you can just neglect it. Last year's sage after being cut down to stubs. And then this is a rosemary. Those are totally different. They're a pain in the ass. But this handful of things, nasturtium, basil, thyme, sage, oregano, along with your tomatoes, these are the easiest because they don't mind so much being neglected or hurt. And they don't mind if their roots get messed with. I also grow fennel and dill. In completely different areas of my garden, I grow the two things. I really love fennel. I have like an obsession with roasting it, so I grow a lot of that. But it's really similar to basil, where you just keep it warm and let it drink and it'll grow. Now, the things that are harder to grow are things like squashes. So when you're growing any kind of squashes, they really don't like their roots messed with. This includes cucumbers, by the way. So you might want to plant them a little later, so they only have to be repotted or moved one time. And it's very helpful to get all of the dirt, all of the roots, without moving them around. It's a totally different thing. But tomatoes and herbs are the easiest starter things to grow. So I would suggest if you're starting this year, start with tomatoes. Even just buy a few starts or get some from a garden exchange and just wait until it's warm out, get them used to being in the sunshine, and stick them right in the ground. Bury them deep so that they only have a little bit of the head sticking out of the ground, and they will take off. They don't mind if you're mean to them. They kind of like it.